we tend, by a secret law of the soul, to move towards our mental image of God. What do you think about when you think about God? The answer could not be more important for an individual person and for us as a society, for an individual Christian and for us as a church. And it means that what really matters is what we think about God in the deepest recesses of our head and our heart. That matters more than what our church statement of faith might say. That matters more than what we might say about God when we're asked about Him. Because we tend towards what we truly believe about God. Whether you have believed in God for a lifetime, or whether you're not sure if you do, who do you think God is? There could be no more important question. So this is God. An introduction.
Today, we're going to be digging in to the next in our series about God. And so helping us to understand something of the doctrine of God, if you like. And today's attribute is his omnipotence. Now, I'll get into that in a moment, but let me start by reading Psalm 8, because it gives us a glimpse. It kind of opens the curtains on the scenery. Psalm 8. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens, and from the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise, because of your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place. What is man that you're mindful of him? The son of man that you care for him. You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him ruler over the works of your hands and put everything under his feet, all flocks and herds and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and all that swim in the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. This is a great psalm, and it starts to give us a glimpse of God. It starts to give us a glimpse of God shown in his creation, and it starts to give us a glimpse of how God uses the pinnacle of his creation, us, to bring about his glory on the earth. And so it's a wonderful psalm to try and give that kind of big view of how God is working. We need to understand what it means for God to be omnipotent. We need to understand what it means. And that in itself, I'll be really honest with you, is a challenge. But it's a challenge worth attempting, because when we begin to see God as he really is, it changes us and it changes everything. You know, one of my favourite preachers, Charles Spurgeon, New Park Chapel in Southwark in 1855, he said this about us thinking about God. He who often thinks of God will have a larger mind than the man who simply nods around this narrow globe. The most excellent study for expanding the soul is the science of Christ and him crucified and the knowledge of the Godhead in glorious Trinity. Nothing will so enlarge the intellect, nothing so magnify the whole soul of man as a devout, earnest, continued investigation of the great subject of the deity. Plunge yourself into the Godhead's deepest sea. Be lost in its immensity, and you shall come forth as from a couch of rest, refreshed and invigorated. Don't you just love his Victorian, flowery metaphor language? I love it. I love it. So he says, plunge into the study. So let's plunge in, and let's hope that we get the same results, that we come out invigorated and refreshed. We're going to preach. I'm going to preach for a little while, and then I'm going to get Jason and the band up. We're going to have a bit of a ministry time at the end as well, just to begin to dig into some of the things that we uncover today. So, omnipotent. It's not a word that I use in my daily walk, really, very often. I don't go into Sainsbury's and declare the manager to be omnipotent. It's not something that I talk to my children or grandchildren about omnipotence. So what does it mean? Well, it comes from two Latin words, omni meaning all, and potens meaning powerful. So we get this idea of being something to do with God being all powerful. Now, we know that God is sovereign, that he's a king. And sovereignty and omnipotence go together. They have to go together. One can't really exist without the other. To reign, God must have power. And to reign supremely, he must have all power. So if he has to reign sovereignly as king, all power must be his. And that's what omnipotence really means. I guess the term we're more likely to be familiar with, because we're good old Anglo-Saxons, many of us, is the idea of God being almighty. That's the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of omnipotent, almighty. And you'll see that more often in our English Bibles, won't you? The word almighty. It's used 56 times in our Bibles. Interestingly, it's only ever used of God, and it is never used of anybody or anything else. So this is an incommunicable attribute of God. Only God can be omnipotent. Only God is almighty. Okay? So he's unique in the whole of our understanding. So it's an incommunicable attribute. It's an attribute of God that he has that we can't have. You and I can never be almighty. We can be mighty, but we can't be almighty. We can be potent, but we can't be omnipotent. Okay? So only he can do that. We're his creation, though, and that psalm pointed to that. And that means he invests in us a measure of power and a measure of authority. He's delegated some of that to us. Psalm 8 showed that very clearly. And so we need to consider how we use that power, and I'll come to that towards the end. But we can never be all-powerful. Only the Creator can be all-powerful. Only he can have a never-ending, inexhaustible, absolute kind of power. And that, friends, is what makes him worthy of our worship. That's why it's appropriate for us to come and be in awe of him and to bow the knee to him, because of his difference from us and his power. Interestingly, normally when you delegate something in the way that God has delegated a measure of power to humanity, you lose something. So if I had a to-do list and it had 5 items on it, and I delegated 3 of them to Esther, I would lose 3 of them. She would gain 3 of them. But with God and his omnipotence and his power, when he gives it away, he doesn't lose anything. It's interesting. He delegates power to us, but loses none of his power at all. He doesn't become any less by entrusting things to you and I. He remains all-powerful at all times, and when he gives things away to us, nothing is lost at all. He is eternal, and he always has been, and he always will be all-powerful, almighty, omnipotent. So we're starting to get a picture of a God that doesn't run out, wear out, get puffed out, but one who is always all-powerful. And when we look at creation, that gives us one of the most clear glimpses of his omnipotence, of his might, of his power. It's difficult even to look at a beautiful tree in the autumn and not be convinced that there is a creator. But on the times when I go to the Himalayas and look at the Annapurna range of mountains, and it takes your breath away, it gives you a glimpse of the magnitude of his might and his power. David in Psalm 8 put it like this: when I consider the heavens, the works of your fingers, and then brings it down to man. What's man that you're mindful of him? So he catches a glimpse. And then the Apostle Paul, he put it a bit like this when he wrote to the church in Rome. He said, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly understood by what has been made. So Paul as an apostle is saying, when we look at what has been made, it points us to, it directs us to, it helps us to see God's almighty omnipotence. It helps us to see his divine nature and that he is all powerful. So Paul's speaking about his eternal power, never runs out, didn't have a beginning, didn't have an end. Talks about his divine nature. So we're starting to see the nature and the character of God. But it shows us, when we look at this, that there is just no limit. There's no limit to his power. He's infinite. No beginning, no end, no limit. There's literally nothing that God wills that he can't do. Nothing. So here's the challenge. Something's changed in our view of God. David, in Psalm 8, looked and saw creation and said, wow, God. Paul taught the church in Rome and said, look at creation. Wow, God. And throughout all history, mankind has looked at creation and caught that glimpse of the Creator that kept us in our position as creatures and worshippers. They looked at the stars and they fell on their knees in worship to the one who put them in place. They caught a glimpse of the ocean or the mountains and bowed before the Creator. They touched something of that divine nature, of that omnipotence. But in our day, what was sacred has become secular. What was worshipped has become tamed. And we've convinced ourselves foolishly that it is all about us. You see, where our forefathers looked at creation and were humbled in worship, we've come to this foolish conclusion that actually it's just us, and that there is no creator, and that somehow this beautiful planet that we exist on, its success or failure is solely in our hands. Now, we have been commanded to steward it, and that is something that we must take more seriously now than ever. Yet, that's not the primary problem. It's not our stewardship that is the primary problem. It's our decision to make God smaller. You see, when we elevate God to who he truly is, then we will truly take seriously the responsibility to steward and care for the planet that he has entrusted to us. You see, for us who are not omnipotent, to ignore the benefits of worshipping a God who is omnipotent is foolishness. It would be as foolish as me saying, I don't know, okay, well, I'm going to go off and I'm going to leave this microphone here to give you the rest of this message. Do you understand? It's foolish, it's stupid to think that we can exist separate and not bear the consequences. You see, when we remove the awe of God's omnipotence, we become so much less. And one day this folly will be exposed. You see, the trouble is, when we abandon an awe of God and his creation, then it comes down to us as human beings, and our morality becomes blurred and every voice becomes equally important. G.K. Chesterton put it like this. He said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And we can see that in the world around us. Or Alexander Hamilton said, when you stand for nothing, you'll fall for everything. And that's what's happening in humanity right now. We're not standing for anything, but falling for everything. So, I'm trying to convince you that it's important that we understand that God is omnipotent, because there are consequences when we do, good consequences. When we believe God to be who he is, we're dwelling in the area of truth, and then truth sets us free. So let's understand a little bit. I'm going to give you 3 consequences of believing this truth that God is almighty, God is omnipotent. And the first one is this. If God is omnipotent, it means that everything that happens is within his power. I'm going to say that again. If God is omnipotent, it means that everything that happens is within his power. So if God didn't allow it, it would not happen. And this changes our view on suffering, on pain, on trials, even on death itself. When we believe that God is omnipotent and we understand that nothing happens unless he is allowing it. Look at the story of Job. He's a great example of this. So Job was a good man. Job loved God. He had everything. Job's got money. Job's got health. Job's got a good family. Satan hates all of that. He hates how much Job loves God. Many of you will know the story. And so in his envy, Satan says to God, hang on, can I just tempt Job, please? Just to test his faithfulness. And what happens? Job loses everything, literally everything. He loses his family, he loses his animals, he loses his property, he even loses his health. He ends up covered in sores, no one to comfort him. The only one left was his wife, who for some reason was spared, but she tells him to go and curse God and die. And people accuse him, people grieve with him, and Job is like completely broken. He is in the lowest valley of humanity. And he's crying out in his distress. He's weeping. He's even cursing the day he was born. But the one thing he never did, ever, was curse God. Why? Because he had a correct view of God's omnipotence. He knew God was powerful, and he loved God and knew he was loved by God. Therefore, in God's sovereign omnipotence, there must be a reason why this was happening. You see, he knew who God was, and he also knew who he was in light of who God was. So he had the right sense of his own identity and God's identity. And of course, we know the story. God proved to him who he was by showing up in a storm and restoring everything and more to Job, in spite of the suffering. And you know, it's a beautiful illustration, really, of the big picture, in that our suffering, as we cry out to God, one day, all of that will be removed, and we will have more restored to us than we ever lost and we ever thought possible. The new heavens, the new earth, you know, that beautiful picture of an eternal restoration that God is going to accomplish. You see, we keep our eyes fixed on that. It means that the things that we battle day to day right now, and the things that you're going through even now, we understand that God is in it somehow. And we view it very differently. You see, this is good news if you're suffering. If you're suffering right now, this understanding of God's omnipotence is good news for you and for our world, which is continuing to suffer. Let's face it, as we look around the nations of the world, we know that there is so much suffering. War in some places, famine in others, disease in others. But how does Paul describe our suffering in his letters? Light and momentary. Light and momentary. Doesn't feel like that sometimes, does it? But Paul says that it's achieving for us an eternal glory that will far outweigh it all. You see, understanding that God is allowing this, that everything that's happening to you right now is within his power and his sovereignty, gives us a different view of it. And I want to encourage you to place God in the highest place, not the challenge. You know, somebody said to me, how are you doing? And you often hear that phrase, oh, I'm all right under the circumstances. You were never designed to be under the circumstances. You're over the circumstances because the God that you love and serve is omnipotent. And anything that's happening to you in your life right now, he is allowing. That's the consequence of him being all-powerful. The second consequence of God being omnipotent. If God is omnipotent, then it means there's nothing he wants to do that he can't do. There's nothing he wants to do that he can't do. So God has got at his command all power in the universe. He can do anything, and nothing is harder for him than something else. I guess it's worth saying there are some things he can't do, having said that. He can't deny himself. He can't do things that are contrary to his nature. So he can't lie. He can't sin. He can't deny himself. He can't be tempted. He can't cease to be God. He can't cease to exist. He can't act in any way that's contrary to his attributes. But everything else he does with equal ease. I want you to understand that. It's no more difficult for God to heal the sick or raise the dead than it is to give you peace or to open a door for the next stage of your journey. I could say it like this: everything is easy for God. But the way we pray sometimes denies that reality. We'll ask God for little things because we think, oh, he can do that. But when it comes to the big thing, we can sometimes be fearful of asking God for it. Will he? Can he? Well, if our understanding of God is that he is omnipotent and that he can do anything that he wills, then it is equally easy for him to solve the challenge that you're facing right now. Oh, it's too big a thing. You don't understand how rooted that is, or how deep that is, or how much that has hurt me, or how every circumstance is pushing it in the other direction, or how much that person has hurt or rejected me, or how bleak the market looks. You see, whatever it might be, where we undermine God's omnipotence by saying that he can't, we're stepping into heresy. God can. God can. And if he wills, he will. So I just want you to, for a moment, just fix your mind on the big challenge that you're facing right now. And I want you to allow faith to come. Not because of some nice feeling or emotion that you might experience, but because of the truth of his identity. God is sovereignly almighty. There is nothing he cannot do. He can do it all with ease. He doesn't use up any more energy answering your biggest prayer than he does answering your smallest prayer. Everything he does without effort, without getting tired, without getting hungry, without getting worn out, because he is self-sufficient and all his power comes from within. So he doesn't need, like me, to go and recharge or replenish. He's always on full charge. So when you come to him and you touch something of his sovereignty, you're coming to a fully charged up Duracell battery that is all powerful, doesn't run out. You know, there was a Canadian pastor called A.B. Simpson, and he was about my age, but he was really ill, really sick, and his feet were very, very badly damaged, and he was really disheartened. He was at that stage where he was thinking, I'm going to have to give up ministry, I'm going to have to give up leading, teaching, and he was ready to do that. And then one day he heard an old gospel song, and the line in that gospel song said, "Nothing is too hard for Jesus. No man can work like him." And I don't know quite what he experienced, but in that moment, he believed it. He believed that nothing was too hard for Jesus in that moment, and that no man could work like him. And so I guess faith came. Faith came to him that God was God and that God was omnipotent. So he began to pray on the back of that fresh faith. And after he prayed, he stood up and realized that his feet were completely healed. And realizing then that, well, if God can do that, then there's nothing he can't do. He plowed himself into more years of ministry. He went on and started one of the largest missionary works in the world. He wrote 140 hymns. He wrote loads of books. He planted loads of churches. He had 35 years more fruitful ministry serving Jesus because God's unlimited power for him was just exactly what he needed. So when you look at your situation and you say, God can't, we know now that's not true. God will and can. Or as Jeremiah put it in this rhetorical question, is anything too hard for the Lord? I mean, it's rhetorical because it doesn't need an answer. We know the answer. No, nothing's too hard for the Lord. Or perhaps as the Apostle Paul put it to the Ephesians, now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine according to his work within us. Immeasurably more. I quite like the Amplified version, the way that renders that verse. Let me just read it to you. And this is truth. I just want this truth to sink in. Now to him who is able to carry out his purpose and do superabundantly more than all we dare ask or think, infinitely beyond our greatest prayers, hopes, or dreams, according to his power that is at work within us. Superabundantly more than your greatest prayer, hope, or dream. I don't know, what's your greatest prayer, hope, or dream? What's your best possible scenario? What's your most favorable outcome? And now look at God's omnipotence and realize he can do superabundantly more than anything that you hope or pray or dream of. I don't know, but that gives me hope. I can look at some situations in our life and think, how's God going to do that? How are we going to get through that? How's that going to happen? And I can have a very small view of God. But when I see him as he truly is, I have to turn my eyes to heaven and say, God, you can. You can. And if it's your will, you will. Last one, if God is omnipotent, last consequence, if God is omnipotent, then we must use our delegated power in a way that is pleasing to God. You know, having said that omnipotence isn't a communicable attribute of God, it's not something that we can have, but we do have this measure of power since creation, since the Adamic covenant, when he handed over some responsibility to subdue the earth and to fill it. We've had that. We've had a measure of power. We've never been omnipotent, as I've said, but we do have power to bring about things. We have different types of power. We have physical power, but we also have other kinds of power. We've got mental power, the power to think and reason and plan and manage and organize our inner world. We've got spiritual power. You know, we've got power to fight the good fight of the faith, to extend the kingdom, to preach the gospel, to push back the dominion of darkness, to do all of that, to heal the sick, to drive out demons, to do the spiritual stuff. I guess we've got influential power. We can influence things in our world, in life and in leadership and in homes and in communities and in church and in the city and in government. You know, how we steward the earth and its resources. We've got a measure of power in that. It's not that we haven't got it. The question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we use it? You see, people often have a wrong view of power and they see it immediately as something bad. But it's not. Think of power as influence. It's a bit like money. You know, money is great. It's a great resource. Now, of course, if it's idolized and worshipped, it becomes the root of all kinds of evil. But money in itself is not the problem. It's the love of money that is the root of the problem. Money in itself is neutral. It can either be used to raise up the poor, to provide for those who need. It can be used to extend the kingdom and build church and ministry and reach the world. Or it can be used to divide, separate, and make one person very comfortable while others suffer. You see, it's not what it is, but it's how it's used. And it's the same with power. You see, used badly, power brings harm, not good. So power used badly in the home brings harshness. Power used badly in the workplace brings frustration and division. Power used badly in the school playground brings bullying. Power used badly in government brings manipulation. Power used badly in the church brings abuse. And power used badly in the world brings us to a brink of a climate crisis. It just does. But power used well is a glorious thing. Power used well is glorious. Power used well in the home brings order and stability and security and love. Power used well in the workplace brings honor and productivity and delight. Power used well in the school playground brings friendship and love and growth and strength. Power used well in the government brings welfare and relieves suffering. Power used well in the church brings breakthrough for the kingdom. Power used well in the world brings, ecological harmony, care. How does God use his power? That's the question, because it's him that we need to emulate, and this is where I want to come in for a landing. I think Isaiah caught a glimpse of how God uses his power, and I think Jesus did, which is why Isaiah 61 was the key prophecy that Jesus fulfilled publicly by declaring that he was the fulfillment of this word. And I have to say, because we're in Christ by default, this is us too. So this is how we can use power in a way that honors God and brings life, not death. First 3 verses of Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. God's power, correctly channeled, elevates the poor. God's power binds up the brokenhearted. God's power brings freedom to the captives. God's power brings release for prisoners. God's power brings God's favor. God's power brings comfort to those who mourn. God's power brings beauty out of ashes. God's power brings gladness and praise out of sorrow and despair. God's power brings righteousness. And as you use his power in line with his will and his character, you will do exactly the same. Do you understand? That's why we're so passionate about things like Christians Against Poverty or Home for Good. Because we're using God's power to do these things that Jesus fulfilled in his own life and body, that Isaiah prophesied, and that we get to join in with. And that's every one of us. And God will do it through you. I want you to understand that. As you sit, and even in my earshot today, or even if you're watching online, or listening to this in the future, God can exert his power through you as an individual and through your life. Now that might seem daunting. Think about Mary. She was there, a young girl. The angel Gabriel came to her and said, "You know what you're going to do? You're going to bear the Son of God." I mean, can you imagine a more daunting prospect? I mean, she's like, how will this happen? How's that going to happen? And do you remember what he said to her? Nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is impossible with God. And that's why I want to land this message and move into a time of ministry, because I want to dispel the myth that some things that you are facing are impossible for him. That will never happen. I can't see a way through. Nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is impossible. Say it with me. Nothing is impossible with God. So let's do the Isaiah stuff, but let's believe God that he is going to make his power available to us, because he's omnipotent. And we want to be in line with his will. And if he wills it, he can do it. Let's not limit him to our smallest prayers. Let's with confidence pray our biggest prayers.